get everything, all technology working here. All right, so again, so that I don't forget, please remember there's no class on Thursday. We're flipping the classes. So tonight we're going to do fair housing, and if I feel like it, I guess environmental stuff, or if we have time or whatever. We have a little bit of extra time either tonight or a week from tonight. So what we're skipping in the class, again for me to be very clear, is a section called Careers in Real Estate, for which I believe, unless I think I did at the beginning of the semester, there's a link and some documents that are published up online that you can look at. If you have other questions, about sort of what other things you can do within the real estate industry, just talk to me, email me, let me know. What you're missing has nothing to do with what we're testing on in the course, and has nothing to do with what you'll be tested on in the state exam. It's just under the old license law, the previous version, we were trying to cram almost all of the same information into 45 hours instead of into 90. I literally couldn't talk fast enough. And I couldn't add anything extra, and I was constantly, struggling. And there's been some new material added, but not a lot. And I think when they went to 90 hours, they realized, oh, we have some time to fill in, so what else can we do with 6 hours or whatever? I've always woven into the lectures looking at commercial versus residential differently, talking a little bit about a day in the life of or whatever. So all you would have gotten was kind of more of that, and I think there's probably enough of that. But again, if you feel disadvantaged or you want me to cover that in some other way, just let me know. In past semesters we've used that for snow days or whatever, and I just have some personal things going on that I need to take care of. So I won't be here on Thursday. So then a week from tonight, it will either go through 22 and 23 or just chapter 23, and then a week from Thursday night we have our comprehensive final review, and the week after that we have at the beginning of it a comprehensive math review, which takes about a half a class at most, and then whatever other Q&A you want to ask, and then 2 days after that you have the final exam. So that's kind of how we're winding our way through. Now, if you all want to know, and I don't think I have them with me, but I'll bring them a week from tonight, so they'll be here for the last 4 class sessions, including the night you take the final. So if you all want to know your final exam score pretty much right away, some of you are already enrolled in the follow-on Real Estate 105, some of you are not. All you have to do is give me a note that says, and I have a pre-printed form, I'll just have you fill out, that says, please email me my final exam. That way, if I email you, if you didn't pass and it goes to your spouse or to your employer or to your kids or the neighbors or something, you can't claim that I violated your privacy. I'm following your direction. Otherwise, test scores are available when they're posted by the school, which won't be until the end of the semester, so there's no way for you to know how you did. So anyway, I'll have a form, real simple. I just have to remember to bring it in, and you'll be able to fill that out and leave that with me. It takes you 2 minutes to fill it out, sign it, any one of the last 4 nights of the course. The long and short of it is almost everybody gets their final exam score emailed to them before the weekend is over. So you'll take the test on a Thursday, right? And then, by the end of the weekend, you'll know for sure how you did. And I'll give you your score as a percentage, the number you got right out of the 128 total, and what your letter grade is, which will also be your letter grade for the course, presumably. Anyway, questions about any of that, sort of finishing up with the winding down the rest of the way through the course? Okay. So they totaled the car, by the way. Remember, this was the class, right, when my daughter had the accident the one night? Yeah. So they totaled that car, so it's a new experience. In fact, one of the reasons I didn't get farther on these PowerPoint slides today was because she's in a dealership buying herself a brand new car, something she's never done before with no money down and no paying income. She's clearly my daughter. But it's kind of interesting. So that took up a couple of hours of you're doing what? And then I spent some time visiting in a hospital over the weekend, which is always a great way to get your work done. So, alrighty, let's see. So, fair housing is actually one of my favorite subjects in this whole text. You know, like anything else we're going over, other than, you know, certain key chapters like finance and the license law, whatever, there's probably 3 questions on your final exam that relate to what's in chapter 21, but I could talk about it for hours. I'll give you some examples, kind of from industry and some from my own experience that will relate to this. Did any of you watch the Zanesville video that's up online? Okay, and we'll probably watch that this evening too. It's about 18 minutes. Like I said, I mentioned before, it's really partially it's a marketing video for the Ohio law firm that won the case, but it suits our purpose. So it's a very soft sell, so I don't think you'll find it obnoxious, but it's very interesting to me because it's not the typical fair housing case. It's not what you expect when you think of a minority going somewhere and getting turned down to rent an apartment or to apply for financing or to buy a house. It's really nothing like that at all. But it's kind of sorts of things we tend to see in fair housing today. Very big, very broad, and surprisingly committed by government agencies, who in some cases are supposed to be helping people.
It kind of sounded to me like you kind of have to walk on eggshells around this. Is that
No.
because you're not really sure if you're violating it or not? But
Well, not necessarily. Well, that's part of what we'll talk about a little bit. And one of the statements I'll probably make later is that it's very difficult to prove discrimination. It's also very difficult to prove you did not. I didn't get this up on the PowerPoint slides, and it's not in the text, and you won't be tested on this idea, but I probably will come back to it. It's a completely different sort of proof test for civil litigation in fair housing than it is in almost anything other than employment discrimination. So this idea of being innocent until proven guilty does not follow all the way through when it comes to getting out of a discrimination claim. It's so different than other areas of law. I've heard non-lawyers and non-real estate educators explain fair housing in front of crowds that's so bad, I really wanted to run up and say, you know, you should stop talking now. Because in that regard it's different. But I think I can put it into perspective for you tonight. It is an emotional area, and I'll try and debunk some of that emotion as well, but mostly it's a lot of bad habits culturally that we just sort of keep passing forward, and that's kind of how I've modified the slides. I tend to treat this in part tonight as an American history course because it gives us a better sense of why we're still even having to talk about this and that sort of thing. So this is what's up on the board now is my own personal kind of summary. Fair housing is all about equal access. It's all about if you have the money and the credit, you should be able to live where you want, period. If you get that, you get fair housing. That's it. It's no more complicated than that, except for all of the other stuff that we tend to kind of throw in here that gets into how we see each other and that sort of thing. So if you'll bear with me a little bit, let me just sort of walk you through history of the United States in this sort of way, in the way that I see it and understand it. The problem for us for fair housing really is rooted in the idea of slavery and property and gender and property. Remember, it's no different for women who were treated the same as who were treated as property than it was for African Americans. And if you read some of the judicial decisions, even that were written dissenting opinions by justices who meant well, they would at the same time sort of display their prejudice towards Chinese people or something else when they were writing these things in the 19th century. So, we're trying to do in the United States something that nobody else has done. And that is put the broadest possible human diversity under one national roof and make it work. Everywhere you look in the world, neighbors are killing one another. Right? One of the most recent elections that was highly watched recently was Nigeria, a country that's half Muslim, half Christian, and they constantly go back and forth. And they're trying to figure out who hates who the least enough to be able to live under the other's rule. Really, if it wasn't such a small place and if there wasn't so much material wealth there, namely oil, you'd split the country in two and let people sort of live on their own. So, because we're doing these unique things and trying to figure out how to make it work, we're way ahead of the curve in some ways in terms of, what we've tried and failed at, and now how we're trying to sort of legislate our way through this. And so the history is helpful to know. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, right, we had 13 disparate colonies trying to come together and figure out how they could protect themselves from the king. That's what forming the federal, the federal government was all about. And of course, you had states that were slave states and states that were adamantly opposed. There really wasn't anybody sort of on that fence. So you had a lot of articulate arguments about what was wrong with slavery. They're wonderful, they're laudable when you read them 200 and some odd years later. But you still had southern states who said, hang on, you're messing with our property. And so nothing was resolved, right? You just ended up with free states, slave states. And that sort of set a pattern for saying we have a society that has classes. Yet our very foundation of democracy is supposed to be a classless society, yet we've created these classes. So fast forward, was that 70 years to the Dred Scott case. Many of you may have heard of this, remember studying. So Dred Scott was a slave whose owner had taken him into territories where slavery was not legal. So he claimed that because he lived in areas where slavery was not allowed, he must therefore be free. And that case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the U.S. Supreme Court made kind of maybe one of its most embarrassing ranges of decisions ever. So they decided, first of all, any territories after the founding of the country, Congress had no authority to regulate them, including slavery whatsoever. The justices who ruled this way in all these decisions, the 7 who ruled in favor of this decision of denying Dred Scott his right to be free, etc., were all from the South. The 2 who dissented, who thought the decision was bad, were from the North. You can see that the national divide had nothing to change in 70 years. Part of the ruling was if you were of African descent, it didn't matter whether you were slave or free. You could never be a citizen of the United States under this decision, ever. You could never have full citizenship rights. The Missouri Compromise of 1812, no, I think it's actually 1821, sorry, of 1821, which said that when Missouri came into the country, it would be a slave state, and when Maine at the same time would be a free state, and the territory that later became split into Nebraska and Kansas would also be free. That was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, saying you have no right to make those decisions and impose them upon those states. And of course, it was this in 1857 that ended up leading to the Civil War. All of a sudden, people in the country realized, oh, we don't have a choice. This is going to go, become a battle. The next step in this was the Emancipation Proclamation, which everybody thinks is when Lincoln freed the slaves, but Lincoln only freed the slaves where? In the southern states. Specifically those states that rebelled, the slaves were freed. So, it's arguable that what Abraham Lincoln did was to simply, take a swipe at the southern states. There was no act of Congress. This was an executive order, in effect. So there was no act of Congress that said, oh, we feel badly about what we're doing. Let's make sure slavery is free everywhere in the country. That didn't happen at that point in time. This is slightly out of order. This is something because of the information I had to get up here on the slide. So the next step really is the 13th Amendment, which was in 1865. But let's talk very briefly about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is in Olga's copy of the book, but for some reason Dearborn saw fit to take it out of the 8th edition, which is unfortunate, because I believe you could get a question on the Civil Rights Act of 1866 on your state exam. So I don't know why it's not in your text. So basically this being one of the first civil rights laws, particularly that wasn't a constitutional amendment, basically says, and here's the gist of it, everybody has the same rights to own property, etc., as whites. Literally, this is a quote. It uses this language as enjoyed by white citizens. Because it wasn't just black Americans, it was Chinese and anybody else who were an ethnic minority somewhere in the country. Now, the interesting thing about this, if you look at the history of the country in 1866, right, we were at Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Right at the end of the war, of course, Lincoln is assassinated. And when a president dies in office, who becomes president? The vice president. And his vice president's name was Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. Tennessee seceded from the Union. So how did Andrew Johnson end up as Lincoln's vice president? Well, when the South was debating whether to stay in the Union or to secede and form their own country, Johnson believed that secession was wrong. He believed that slavery was right. So here, when Lincoln was assassinated, who do you have sitting in the White House but a president who has said on the record, slavery is the right of the slave states? He only came to the North because he didn't want to secede with Tennessee. He wanted to keep the Union together and continue the debate, I presume. So what do you suppose the President of the United States did with the first civil rights legislation? He vetoed it. Now, the reason that Congress was able to pass this over the veto is that the states weren't readmitted to the Union until 1870, etc. So don't think for a minute that, oh, well, here, we're starting to get our act together. But that was the case at all. The country continued to be a mess in this whole area, at least into the 1950s. And that's within recent memory for some of us sitting here in the room, or certainly of the memory of our parents. This is not a problem that, this is a current problem. This, I guess, is part of what I wanted to point out. So you have this Congress, which is mostly a northern Congress at that point in time, and some of those states even, that didn't secede, but that had people in them who did, like Kentucky, for example. It's well known that the governor of Kentucky, and his sons fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. So the 13th Amendment is where slavery was finally abolished throughout the United States, and the 14th Amendment established some things that you're probably well familiar with, like due process and equal protection under the law. These are basic constitutional provisions that apply to all of us and are used all the time, right? If you were hauled up on charges and were convicted and felt like you didn't have a fair trial, you might argue due process. Well, this really was intended to follow along with all of this sort of Reconstructionist legislation, and to say, look, everybody who was born in the United States, wherever, lives in the U.S. and in that state, giving the states no right to determine whether somebody of African or Chinese or any other descent was a citizen of the United States or of their state or not. The citizenship clause was also very important. And basically what was still happening once all of this was passed, the U.S. Supreme Court in many cases just ignored a lot of this, and the states in the South in particular went on with the same brand of mentality that they had before, except now they couldn't own people of color, they couldn't own other people, so they just passed laws and this idea of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a derogatory term, really, in effect referring to African Americans, and the idea being that the states in the South said, fine, if we have to deal with this post-slavery world, that's fine, but we don't want them living where we are. Hence the idea of kind of long-term segregation. The Plessy versus Ferguson case sort of summarizes all of this, what was going on there for that 30-plus year period after the end of the war. Henry Plessy was a businessman, if I remember correctly, in Louisiana. And this is really funny to me, but there are definitions for how black you are. So he was considered an octoroon. So if your math is good, you'll know that an oct is an eighth. So he was 1/8 black, 7/8 white, under Louisiana law that made him black, because you were either black or you were white. If you were 1/16 black, you were white. If you were 1/8 black, you were black. This was the law. This was Louisiana state law at the time. So a bunch of business people, including the railroads, went to Plessy, and there was a committee, and it was a very diverse group, and they said, we got to get rid of this Louisiana law, and we got to take it to court or whatever. So they convinced him to challenge this statute. And unfortunately, perhaps, the lawsuit was really targeted at railroad cars. So a person would board a railroad car in the north, passenger trains were the norm, then these were high technology thing. And as you got to the south, you would have to leave your car because the cars would have to become segregated, because that's what the state laws, including in Louisiana, said. The railroads hated that, if for no other reason than they didn't want to have to maintain two different sets of cars and porters and everything else. So Plessy sued locally and then the state, and then it went to the, well, I guess that locally was the state, and then it went to the state Supreme Court, where they continued to lose, and went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said in 7-1 decision that, yeah, we kind of agree with this idea of separate but equal. They basically found no problem in, at least when it came to the railroads, that it was any hardship whatsoever on minorities, blacks in particular, to ride in separate cars. So that became sort of the Supreme Court blessed law of the land. There's all kinds of things you can find online, like one of the justices in the case was U.S. Supreme Court justices in the case was himself from Louisiana and a well-known white supremacist. So there were a number of different cases along the way, but fast forward to post-World War II, when a lot of African Americans returned from the war, where literally, African American troops conquered the Alaskan Highway, did things in engineering, did things that nobody thought they could do, where they helped liberate cities in Italy and wherever else, and were hailed as conquering heroes along with all U.S. troops. They came back to the United States once again to be second or third class citizens. And so there was a lot of pressure that was building also through litigation that started in the 30s and 40s. And so Brown versus Board of Education is actually an amalgamation of a lot of litigation put into one case. And the whole thing here was to test the separate but equal provision, which had been sort of cemented in Plessy. And the U.S. Supreme Court in the Brown case basically ruled that in the case of education, separate but equal was illogical. And their logic in the decision was the following. You can't take a minority child and segregate them completely from the majority culture in which they're going to live, educate them in that segregated manner, and then expect them to function as equals in society at large. That was the basis of the ruling in Brown versus Board of Ed. There was no, gosh, this discrimination or this stuff is bad or whatever. It was just that sort of logical view. So we were still kind of stumbling our way towards complete equality for all people. In fact, and I mean no disparagement, I have nothing but the highest regard for Dwight Eisenhower, but as an older white male, it's kind of interesting to me that one of the quotes that I remember of his the best is one where he was quoted as saying, referring to schooling in this particular case, and of course referring to his white perspective, same as mine might have been 60 years ago, no one wants their daughter to sit next to an overgrown Negro in school. This was the mentality that was ruling the country. So in the next campaign, Kennedy was really the first major well-known candidate, of course he won, to come out and sort of champion what was at the time considered the Negro cause. Right? He was all about equal rights, etc., and one could question did he do that for political expediency because he needed the votes, right? Who won the popular election in 1960? Nixon won the popular election, Kennedy won the electoral vote, so it was extremely close. And in office, Kennedy had tried to get some legislation passed, but really wasn't very effective at it. In fact, Congress looked at John Kennedy as somebody who was an elitist, if that sounds familiar, from the Northeast who didn't resonate with them. And so a Congress that particularly was, still had a lot of sort of Southern sentiment in it, saying, we're still not over the Civil War, basically. We're not interested in all the civil rights legislation, the equality nonsense, really had little to no idea. And so no civil rights legislation of any kind, except for the Equal Pay Act, was passed during Kennedy's administration. John Kennedy was more interested in things like Vietnam and Cuba, right? He was very much a foreign affairs kind of big thinker president. His father had been ambassador to Germany before him, and so that was kind of that thinking there. Kennedy himself, of course, a decorated World War II hero. So then what changed? Well, there was a lot of shifts in society in the 60s, some of which revolved around the Kennedy family. Of course, when JFK was assassinated, there's a certain rally around the flag mentality that happens when your country is attacked, even if it's just the head of your state. And so Kennedy was assassinated, and what happens by 1964, Lyndon Johnson, who's from the South and who was a big champion of civil rights, kind of left his Southern colleagues in Congress, he having once been one of them, very little argument when he came out and championed it. So in 1964, we had the first real modern, significant civil rights legislation. You begin to see, this was also on the heels of a lot of protests and media coverage, and so socially, things are changing a lot. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not include our fair housing type stuff or Indian rights or a few other things that happened in 1968. And Titles 1 through 6 do deal with discrimination, but Title 7 in particular deals with employment discrimination. And that employment discrimination served as the basis under common law or case law for how future fair housing cases were tried. So little by little, we made some adjustments. There's a lot in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits governments from discriminating amongst these same original classes of national origin and color and race and religion. The Jones v. Mayer case, which you could see a test question on at the state exam, this really a century later, finally the U.S. Supreme Court goes, oh no, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is good law, and we're gonna use it. So one of the differences with the Fair Housing Act that we're about to look at and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is overseen by the Department of Justice and the court system. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 has no exemptions. So if a person has a case related to rights that are broader than, gee, I was denied an apartment, Civil Rights Act of 1866 could be something you would sue under or also file a claim under. It's just that in that case, you go to the Department of Justice, and if they think your claim is good, they take it straight to federal court. Whereas under the Fair Housing Act, we'll look at, you go to HUD, and it might go through an administrative procedural process, so they're handled differently. But the Jones v. Mayer case proved that that law, ignored for a century, is on the books. And the interesting thing about that law, as we're about to look at the Federal Fair Housing Act, looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1866, is not only are there no exemptions to it, but it's not considered a fair housing law, it's a civil rights law. So as a property owner who owns office and retail property, if I refused to lease to somebody because they weren't white, they couldn't sue me under the Federal Fair Housing Act because it's not housing. But they could sue me under the Civil Rights Act of 1866 because there's no exemptions there. Doesn't matter what relationship I had to the property. So, you know, it has its place. Though most, when we're talking about fair housing in the United States, mostly we're talking about the Federal Fair Housing Act as amended. So including the amendments up through 1988. That's really the majority of what we're going to talk about, and the majority of what you're likely to get tested on at the state exam is that Fair Housing Act and its amendments. So the textbook talks a little bit about, defines housing, and we'll talk a little bit about familial status and disability, but I also just want to look at, what the classes are and talk a little bit about protected classes and about what discrimination really means. So here's the protected classes listed here for the Federal Fair Housing Act as amended. The first four were the original four. Then we had the gender or sex edition, and then in '88 we added disability and familial status. Now out of those 7 protected classes, imagine there are tens of thousands of complaints filed with HUD every year for housing complaints. So out of these tens of thousands of complaints that are filed every year, which one of those protected classes do you suppose serves as the basis for the most claims? Keeping in mind that some of these classes are smaller and some of these classes include all of this. So which one or ones of these do you think are the highest? Particularly, let's start with what think's number 1 every year now? Race is a logical choice. Anybody else agree with that? Anybody else want to guess something else? It's disability now. It was race until very recently, but for the last 5 to 6 years, it's been disability. Now, the numbers are pretty close. And if you took out disability, race would win by a long shot, if you want to call that winning, because that's really a big part of what things are built on. But the interesting thing here is that in our propensity to look at people and judge based upon what we think we see, it's fairly easy when it comes to disability to make judgments that aren't necessarily aimed at that person's individual personality or some characteristic that's immaterial like the color of their skin, but something that very clearly appears like it would matter, like their mental capacity or their physical ability to get around. And then this whole idea of disability that opens up under the Fair Housing Act and ADA, this idea that you have to make reasonable accommodations to people who are disabled, opens up a whole new area of judgment that we're not always really good at. So that's where disability becomes kind of a big area. Now, as we're going forward in time, the number of protected classes grows, right? And we saw that there were none, then there were 4, then there were 5, then there were 7, and now the federal statute hasn't changed in 27 years. And when we look at Illinois, towards the end of these slides, Illinois has almost twice as many protected classes as the federal statute. So that happens too. When you get away from the federal arena and get to the states, or even get to very local, like Cook County or individual municipalities, you might get an even slightly broader targeted range of protected classes. because you have greater political will to say we were trying to protect this group. Right? So in Illinois, sexual orientation is protected, but at the federal level it is not. Because there's too broad a set of views, nationally for people to agree on that, so federally it just sits, whereas there are many states, such as Illinois, that will protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation. And you can see what the firestorm that's being unleashed in Indiana, regardless of how you think, it's still just a demonstration of the wide gulf that exists in some parts of the country as to how people's behavior should be legislated and dealt with. Now, with what we've talked about so far, and with this up here, let me just ask you a question. Is discrimination legal or is it illegal? You're saying it's illegal. Would anybody here want to stand up and argue that discrimination is legal? Forget about Indiana. But would anybody want to stand up and argue that discrimination is legal?
Discrimination is a pretty general term.
It is a very general term, but we can define it. What does it mean to discriminate?
Kind of like a bias, but like you discriminate against somebody who has like a felony, so you're not going to hire them.
Okay, so to discriminate really means to select between options or to choose. If you describe somebody as having discriminating tastes, it would be a compliment, right? They can choose between, they have a wine palate, or they can tell the difference between these two cheeses, or, their taste in music. So I want to put out to you this idea, because the word discrimination has taken on, it's taken kind of a hit. It's kind of taken on this negative stigma, but to discriminate is not necessarily bad. And in the broadest, loosest sense of what the dictionary definition of discrimination is, I'm going to tell you discrimination in the United States is legal. Legal, not illegal, legal. And the whole reason we have civil rights legislation is because we recognize that in the past we discriminated on bases we now think are a bad idea. So since we're free people, right, as Americans, that's the basis of our society, you're free to do what you choose unless the law says otherwise. So when you get test questions that deal with can I do this or can I not do this, or you have situations in practice, can I do this or can I not do this, remember that not everything that's discriminatory is illegal. It's only illegal if it has been made so or if it's outlawed. Now you are free in some ways to say, that's okay, even though I can legally discriminate, I'm not going to. But it's important for test purposes to know the difference. So Brady brought up the example in my question earlier about what if you decide you don't want to hire or you don't want to rent to a felon. When we look at exemptions under the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Act specifically says if the person is threatening to the landlord, to the manager, or to the population of the dwelling, you're free to discriminate against them. Well, that's not really terribly well defined either. What if as an older white male, I'm afraid of anybody of color, for example. Gee, I watch TV and all the villains are all black, so I don't want anybody black in my house. Well, I could argue under the Fair Housing Act, I'm terrified because, but then what's really the underlying reason? The underlying reason isn't because they're a felon or show violence or are angry or are drunk or don't have mental capacity or have a samurai sword strapped to their hip. It's simply because I have fear for which there's no real legitimate justification. So you really have to go back and kind of look at these things on a case-by-case, line-by-line basis. So it's good to know what these protected classes are, and to have a sense of, okay, I cannot discriminate on these reasons. So let's talk a little bit about these protected classes, in particular the ones that are you need a little bit more definition. So we'll start with familial status. I'm not sure the book is as well defined as it should be. It talks about, I think, that the fact that you can't discriminate against, for example, a woman who's pregnant would be protected under familial status, but so is anybody who's in the process of adopting. So if you're in the process of waiting for a child to come from Russia or the local hospital or orphanage or whatever, you can't be discriminated against either. And there are cases where, particularly if you've read this chapter well enough to understand that there's an exemption for senior housing, there have been cases where apartment owners will say to current renters who all of a sudden are with child or going to adopt or have recently had a child or adopted, oh, you know, we have an exemption. We're a senior property. We know you weren't over the age limit, but we got 20% we can play with, but now that you have kids, you have to leave. What's the deal with discrimination against families? I mean, it's not a virulent hatred of, I think you're inferior to me, I think you're property. What is it?
You're old.
Yeah, and what do families have?
I live in one of those.
Yeah.
And I'm
They-
pretty happy not having kids screaming. all
Exactly. It's the children, right? They're noisy, they don't do what you say, they run up and down the
around.
hallway.
And stuff.
Yeah, it's true. So, I mean, there's a challenge there, but we've made a decision now as a society that we don't want to discriminate against families with kids, except to the degree that we have this carve-out in the Fair Housing Act, or in the Illinois Human Rights Act, or in the Cook County Human Rights Act, that say things like, if your housing meets the following criteria and is approved by HUD, either no more than 20%, you know, of people in a certain age or whatever, or no children, or nobody under 65 whatsoever. It's up to that housing complex to go through that process. So, you know, we've said it's okay, but in other areas, it's not. So again, you know, the Fair Housing Act is trying to figure out how to legislate how we should feel and act. And you can't really sort of cure certain kinds of things through legislation. But the idea that at some point in time, I want to choose whether I have children in my midst or don't is kind of a logical outcome of getting to a certain age. So that's the idea of, you know, familial status, is to not discriminate against the families that have kids because, again, they're noisy and they don't pay attention and they, you know, can be problematic. Disability, it's either a mental or physical impairment, and this gets tested a lot as to what that means. Let me give you an example of how challenging this kind of thing can be. Remember I said you're free to discriminate, right? I mean, you know, so if somebody's just obnoxious, you just say no to them. We'll come back to some more examples here. But there was a case I looked at maybe 10 years ago in California, I think it was, where a woman was just an obnoxious tenant. And by this I mean she just made a lot of demands. And demands to which she wasn't entitled to under the lease. She just was you know, she was a high maintenance person, I guess. Then one day she gets injured at work. And now she has a problem being ambulatory, and she later is determined to be disabled. So she's got this disability now that she didn't have in the previous time. She didn't move, not a new apartment complex, not a new tenant, but her status shifted from being an annoyance to being a member of a protected class. And when she went to the apartment complex and asked for and then insisted on a dedicated parking space, not a handicapped space, but a dedicated space for her up against the building so that she knew she would have a place to park, and they turned her down repeatedly, she sued and won a large judgment. Because the management of this complex failed to recognize that shift. She went from being a nuisance to being in a protected class. An odd kind of circumstance, to be sure, but you see what can happen here, right? You could, you know, she comes and she wants, you know, a parking space, and she asks for it for 10 years, and you say no, you have the right to just say no, we're not giving you that, until she has this. And then once she fits into this category of being disabled for whatever reason, now you're obligated under the law to make a reasonable accommodation. If you fail to do so, now the bad guy or gal is the apartment complex, not the person who's been making those requests. And again, as odd as that may seem, it's the kind of thing that can happen. So when you're analyzing these test questions or analyzing these scenarios, you really have to look at it and go, are we talking about a membership of a protected class? Because if we're making the decision for somebody who is in a protected class, that's going to happen. You know? I mean, if I find somebody who's of a minority religion, maybe it's Muslim, maybe it's something else, can I refuse to rent to them because of that? No. But I can refuse to rent to Muslims or Baha'is or any other minority religious group I want all day long based upon their lack of income, low credit scores, things that have nothing to do with being in a protected class. This is also kind of where discrimination is legal. HUD even says, tongue-in-cheek, but they do this in one of their advertisements. There's one color upon which you can always discriminate, and that is the color of green. Yeah, it's green, you know, it's money. There's nothing in here that poor is not listed here. I have an investor and also who did a lot of apartment deals in the city, co-investor, fellow that I know pretty well, who once described Hyde Park in Chicago, where the president lives, or you know, near where the president lives, kind of on the border of Hyde Park, Kenwood, as a perfect example of in Chicago of blacks and whites working together to be against the poor. But see, you can discriminate against people for lack of money. That's part of our culture. Everybody's expected to sort of figure out how to make that work on your own. So that's what we do. You don't have enough money, we're not going to rent to you. Or, you know, we'll sell to you, but you're going to pay a higher interest rate, or whatever the case may be, because we're trying to figure out the risk. That's all built into our models. I think I mentioned this when we talked about financing. The more money you have down, and the better credit score you have, the better interest rate you're going to get. So as you get less capable, we still loan to you up to a point, but we charge you more money. Kind of backwards if you think about it logically, but that's what we do. So again, you know, not all discrimination is illegal. What other kind of discrimination against specific people or classes of people is perfectly legal when we're talking particularly about rental housing? So think about an apartment complex. What are some of the rules that are basically legalized forms of discrimination? Anybody here own a dog or a cat? Some buildings have no pet rules. That's discrimination, isn't it? We're discriminating against pet lovers or pet owners. Perfectly legal. You can have, sure, we'll rent to you if you have a dog up to 20 pounds. But between 20 and 40 pounds, we need another $100 a month. Over 40 pounds, we need $200 more a month, and a separate pet deposit. And maybe even a non-refundable deposit. We'll allow cats but no dogs, dogs but no cats, dogs and cats but no pot-bellied pigs. That's discrimination. You can discriminate easily today against smokers, right? No smoking anywhere on the property, not even in your own apartment. Perfectly legal. It's a form of discrimination, but it's a legal form of discrimination. You're making broad-based decisions that aren't under, you know, protected class. So prior to 1974, it was perfectly legal to discriminate based on sex or gender. It was perfectly legal to discriminate on familial status or disability until it was outlawed in 1988. And this is where, when we look at the Illinois Human Rights Act a little bit later, it's really important to see that and the fact that we have almost twice as many protected classes when we're really talking about how we're going to practice, because some of those might be esoteric enough that you might not even know what I'm talking about when you read what I have up there or what's in the book. The textbook talks about the importance of using the fair housing symbol. Get used to that as soon as you get into practice. I always put the little EEO and little fair housing symbol on any of my flyers and things that I would do in real estate. So you'll want to do that. Should be part of the office policies and procedures, all that kind of thing. There's discriminatory language that HUD disapproved of many years ago. What that means exactly is a little bit funky. So back to our exemptions under the Fair Housing Act. You can, again, you have senior housing, right? Those complexes of various sorts that are there. If you have what's called the Mrs. Murphy's exemption, this is where if you own up to a 4-unit building, you can discriminate on who you allow to live in it as long as you live in the building. Right? So if I'm not a real estate licensee and I own a 4-flat, I can say whites only under the Fair Housing Act. I can't say whites only under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But the Federal Fair Housing Act, you can discriminate. Now, so the race thing won't fly if somebody sues you in federal court. If they go to HUD, HUD's going to say, that's a 4-flat and they live in it. Fair Housing Act is all we administer. Go talk to the Department of Justice. Can I say I don't want anybody with a disability? Yep. Can I say men only, women only? Yep. No families with children in my 4-flat if I live there? Yep. Because it's carved out. Now, real estate brokers are generally thought, it's not 100% clear because there's 2 different types of exemptions in the Fair Housing Act, and the real estate broker definition is only listed in one of them. But the general thinking is that, and I don't know of any case law about it, but the general thinking is if you have a broker's license, once you're a licensee, you don't get any exemptions under the Fair Housing Act. So now if I'm me, as a managing real estate broker licensee, and I have a 4 flat, I can't discriminate at all. I have to allow people, because I'm a professional. I don't have that same right. No discriminatory ads whatsoever. This is very interesting. How many of you are familiar with Craigslist? Pretty much everybody, right? Craigslist, as we mentioned under one of the leasing or property management chapters, is the place to go for advertising, for renting single family or apartments or whatever. It's very effective. So HUD sued Craigslist a few years ago under the Fair Housing Act because Craigslist, at least then, was rife with discriminatory ads that would violate HUD's old rules and in some cases are blatantly, obviously inappropriate. Christians only, no blacks, whatever, no Muslims. That's the kind of thing that people would put in there. And so you would think this would be a slam dunk lawsuit, right? HUD files Craigslist and says this is all discriminatory advertising, we're going to force you to stop. So who won the case? Naturally, Craigslist did. Because Craigslist made the argument that said, look, if the Unabomber mails somebody a pipe bomb, the Postal Service isn't liable. This discriminatory advertising, we're just the conduit. We're the Postal Service. Don't blame us for what our individual non-paying patrons are doing on our website. We can't police it. If we have to do this, we're gone. We're out of business. And the federal judge agreed. So now Craigslist also, to stave off future litigation and appeals, et cetera, from HUD, has agreed to be more affirmative, to enter into some sort of word scrubbing software like the MLS has. You put a listing in that says something like the word child in a listing in the MLS, it's going to get yanked automatically by their system until they can manually review it. It uses the word age, it's going to get yanked automatically. Some of this is a little bit funky, so it's not really this clear, but what happened was many years ago, HUD was suing the newspapers, saying you've got this paid classified ad, you've accepted it, and it's clearly discriminatory. And so then the newspapers went overboard to the point, I'll give you an example. So there are no standing HUD advertising regs today, but there were up until 1995. And I still see them in real estate education materials. But they set a precedent, and the industry is more self-policing today. So I wanted to place an ad a number of years ago that said, walk to schools, shopping, train, whatever else I had there. What's the problem with my ad? The word walk. The response from the classified department at the newspaper said, sir, walk is on our list that we don't allow that word in housing ads. Not everyone is ambulatory. The word walk has never been prohibited by HUD. It has never been used in a court case that I know of to bring damages against somebody. But once the lawyers were involved, they really scoured every single possible word, what should we use or what should we not use. And so I could use close to, near, but not walk to. So you'll find out some of this when you go to do advertising. Most real estate brokerage offices of any size have an advertising department, but be aware that where the language comes from for the ads, if you didn't write it yourself, will come from the remarks that you, the listing agent, put into the MLS. That'll be this, several hundred characters of words that the advertising department will grab and they will build off of that. So be careful what you put in those remarks. They'll be scrubbed and they'll be used in some cases. Either way, it could cause you a problem. Because if you put something in there that pulls the listing, you might not even recognize it's not active for days and your property's not being marketed. If it doesn't get pulled, it should have, your advertising department may mistakenly use some inappropriate verbiage. It's always a challenge. What do you do? You can't say things like, near a church gives the impression that it's a neighborhood for Christians. You can't say, something like close to the synagogue, same problem. So what do you do if your neighborhood is called St. Ben's? Probably have to find a different way to refer to it. Even that could be kind of problematic. Anything that limits, you know, the view of what people may think about who's welcome there could turn out to be a fair housing violation. Again, because you're giving people the impression I'm not welcome in that neighborhood. And we're professionals, so we're held to a higher standard. The ADA, it's not really fair housing, but in some ways, ADA and fair housing overlap. Another thing that the Fair Housing Act does, that the text just touches on a little bit, is it creates a set of codes for accessibility for disability. And ADA does the same thing. So now ADA impacts us in a few different areas. Title I has to do with, you know, if you have 15 or more employees, you have to make sure that they have reasonable accommodations and that they have reasonable access to get to their desk, their workspace, whatever. That would impact you as a property management firm, as a real estate brokerage. If you've got your own firm, you'll be affected by Title I of ADA. Title III says we want all citizens, including those who are physically or mentally disabled or impaired, to have access, full access, to businesses, goods, and services. That now is a much broader implication for things like transit agencies, government agencies, and even in building codes. So if I have a grocery store that was built in 1958 and it's not handicap accessible, I can probably continue to operate like that forever. It's grandfathered. But if I want to go and make some modification and the current building code kicks in, it isn't even a matter of what ADA will say to me as the grocery store owner. ADA has already said it multiple times to the local municipality, and a lot of the ADA, all of the ADA provisions today should be enshrined in the local building code. So when I go to make those modifications, the local building code officials are going to make me make the thing handicap accessible. That's kind of where ADA kicks in. And the Fair Housing Act does something similar, but only with housing properties at the same time. Okay? Now, when we're looking at people who are disabled and we're talking about the Fair Housing Act and we're talking about ADA, what does this reasonable accommodation thing mean? I mean, if I have somebody come to live in my apartment complex and I don't have any handicap units on the first floor, and I don't have an elevator in the building because it's a 3-story walk-up, and I have somebody come who's in a wheelchair, do I have to turn my only remaining first floor unit into a handicapped unit at my expense? Is that considered a reasonable accommodation? Or is that considered to be too burdensome? This kind of thing really matters.
I think they said that you have to allow the person to be able to make the accommodations.
Right, so what the law has said is the reasonableness here is going to be we're not going to force you to spend any money. But we are going to force you to allow the other person to spend their own money. So sometimes people with disabilities have government grants. Maybe it's from like the Veterans Administration, locally or from the state, or maybe it's from the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation or somebody like that who said, yeah, we're going to help you. We're going to give you 10 grand to go in and renovate the place. That you have to allow. So the reasonable accommodation is such that you have to allow them at their expense to make those modifications. Now that they've modified my place and they've changed it, can I put in the lease that they have to have a higher security deposit? I mean, can I force them to put it back into its original condition? Let me ask that question first. So at the end of the lease, can I force them to put it back in its original condition?
Yes.
Well, let's think about what they did in the first place. So somebody is in a wheelchair, for example. What are some of the kinds of things they're likely to do if it's an older apartment? Widen the doorways, so you can get in and get out. Have better turnaround areas in bathrooms and that kind of thing. Today the radius is like 5 feet turning area. Grab bars would be pretty normal for lots of different conditions behind and around toilets, on cabinets, and in the shower area. And then countertops. 36-inch high countertops in a wheelchair, maybe you reduce them down to 24 inches. Light switches would be lower. Things like that would make sense for somebody who's operating at a much lower level. I mean, physically, who's just shorter, if you will. So now, once they've done all those modifications and they're ready to leave, are all those modifications equally going to be treated the same? That I can force them to put everything back the way it was? It's going to come back again to a test of reasonableness. Very few people complain when the door is too wide, so you're probably not going to be able to force them to make the door narrower. Take out grab bars, other things, make less of a radius, turning radius in a bathroom, probably not. But things like raise the cabinets back up and raise the light switches back up to, yep, those things you may be able to. So then now that there's going to be expenses of some kind that we can agree that are going to have to be done at some time in the future, maybe it's a year out, it's 20 years out, I don't know, can I force this disabled tenant or request from this disabled tenant to put up a higher security deposit to cover all of these costs or even some of the costs? What do you think?
I'd say yeah.
I say yeah.
You can charge someone extra to have a dog.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So-
I'm going to hire him as my property manager. He'll keep me out of court. So the answer is no, because we're talking about a protected class. And we're talking about security deposit and rent. These are basic terms. You cannot change or alter the terms for somebody based upon their membership in a protected class. So you cannot charge a disabled person higher rent because of any factors, and you cannot have them have a higher security deposit. Now, think about how laws are crafted. They're very narrow, they're very specific. So you can have an agreement whereby the disabled person pays into an escrow account over time, and that escrow account is jointly payable, and it's there for the purpose of putting things back in order. That is allowable because it's not called a security deposit. So it's kind of the same thing, but it's definitely different. It's an interesting thing. People with disabilities, once they're in an apartment, oftentimes they don't want to leave. Now they've got a place just the way they like it, and life is hard for them, right? They're not ambulatory, or they can't get around as well, or whatever, and they have what they want, and they are where they want to be, and they make for some excellent long-term residential tenants. So, something you kind of have to look at. Also, let's look at back in our situation where we're talking about that 3-story apartment building. It's a walk-up, no elevator. So you have no units at all available on the first floor. Not even a non-handicap accessible. There's just nothing available on the first floor. They're all leased. You've got a unit or two available on the second or the third floor. Of course, none of them in this case are have any kind of handicap facilities to them whatsoever. And you're managing the building, or you're doing the leasing or whatever on a Saturday, and a person comes up in a handicap accessible type van, get out, they're in a wheelchair, and they come up to you and they say, I'm really in a hurry, I don't have a lot of time, and don't waste my time, please. What have you got available for me? Referring to what's available in the apartment complex for him. What would you say? What would you tell him? What are you going to tell him?
Exactly what you have to do.
Why? Guy just said, don't waste my time. So why would you tell him about second and third floor units?
You would tell anyone.
That's exactly correct. So even not giving the same information to somebody because of their disability would violate their civil rights, because you didn't give them the decision or the opportunity to decide whether they could or couldn't make that work. I didn't tell you anything about this person. I didn't tell you whether they just had surgery. I didn't tell you that they were permanently disabled, right? So you treat everybody the same. Worst thing, they look at you and they go, look, stupid, I can't get to the second or the third floor. And you suffer that 30-second indignity and it's over, right? I mean, otherwise, anything less, and you've now given them less information than you would have given somebody else. So even in the exchange of information, or what you provide or who you provide it to, it's very important to always think about that. Where you advertise, how you advertise, in what language you advertise, even that kind of thing eventually could give rise to claims of preferential treatment if you're not careful. Last thing with disabilities, so we have a building with a no pet rule. No pets whatsoever. Don't even allow, fish in bowls or whatever. No pets. Person with a disability comes to the building and wants to rent. Can we say no because of their seeing eye dog or their miniature horse or their capuchin monkey? And what's the main difference? Why can't I say to them, I have a no pet rule, we don't allow animals in the building? Yeah, not classified as a pet, they're considered a service animal. And service animals are a very broad group. People are training dogs to be able to go to the dryer, open it, and drag laundry into a basket and drag the basket into another room so the person who can't get up and move or carry a heavy load can now sit and fold their laundry. Capuchin monkeys have great dexterity of hands. I may have mentioned to you earlier, one of my favorite CE courses was learning about service animals. Miniature horses, small horses they live longer than dogs. They're less messy. Being bred especially for that kind of purpose. So there's a lot of different types of service animals, and companion animals for emotional reasons is a big deal today. You know, somebody may need it for their mental well-being, their emotional health, suffering from depression or anxiety or whatever, and they feel better having a companion of some kind. Be very, very careful how you handle these things. So you have the right to ask somebody to prove their disability. But after that, I would tread very lightly. There have been a number of cases where people push back one too many times against the person with the disability, and they end up being fined or sued. So, you have a doctor's note, you have a handicap placard in your car, that kind of thing is acceptable. After that, be careful, because it's not perfectly defined. Steve?
Is the service animal registered?
Some are, but even there have been cases where people have won, their cases, disabled people won their cases when they had service animals who were not registered. So, like an apartment complex, trying to sort of be having good habits and procedures, like we've been talking about in a lot of things in this course. One of the checking things is check the registry. Is it a legitimate service animal, right? Because you're trying to avoid other tenant complaints. Somebody is like, this guy's got a small horse in his friggin' apartment. What's going on with that? You won't let me have a goldfish in a bowl, and he's got a horse. Well, it's a service animal. Yeah, really? Is it a registered service animal? And now you've got somebody probing, asking you questions. So you can see where the complex might want to set up some rules and say we're going to verify it with a physician. We're going to see that it's registered. But not all service animals are registered. Nor are there typically laws, nor is there anything in the Fair Housing Act that requires them to be registered. This comes down to what seems like a reasonable amount of justification. Any other questions about any of these things? All right. Looking at the Fair Housing Act and all of these different things that come along, let's talk about some of the main terms. Some of the stuff on this slide are more important than others. Let me sort of distill out here. I've already talked about the local code issues for the Federal Fair Housing Act and ADA, so we've done that. But let me pull on this slide out the words blockbusting, steering, and redlining. These three, I really didn't do much with this slide, these three really should be together, and are three things you're going to want to understand the definition of absolutely for certain. For the course, for practice, for the state exam. So blockbusting is typically working with sellers. They use the case of, they talk about fear peddling or panic peddling. White flight would be an example of this. Even the projection that, hey, the neighborhood's getting flooded with Arabs or Muslims or blacks or Jews or whomever you want to choose as your weapon of choice, to encourage other people to move out, kind of scare them into leaving the neighborhoods. Get out now before the values drop. Those are all examples of blockbusting. So this is an illegal activity, result in fines. If you're a real estate agent, loss of license, loss of livelihood. Now, it isn't just enough to know that blockbusting, steering, and redlining are all no-no words, are all bad things to do, but you can get a test question where it kind of gives you a scenario and then asks you which of the following is it, blockbusting, or redlining, or steering, or whatever, and you're left with figuring out, oh yeah, which is which. Okay, so blockbusting is dealing with sellers. Steering is typically working with buyers, though it can also be working with renters. Steering is literally that, steering or channeling buyers or renters into or away from particular areas. So a rental example would be perfect, would be families with kids. you know? Yeah, sure, we rent to families with children, no problem. The building's in the back by the dumpsters, you can live back there. Should be able to live in whatever apartment they choose to pay the rent for. And with buyers, sometimes it's even done innocently. You know, we have ethnic neighborhoods, they just exist. So you can imagine, you know, that you get people who come to a real estate office kind of wanting to live somewhere where they'll be comfortable. But I'll give you two quick examples, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also serious, about how it doesn't really matter who's doing the steering. So let's say it's my office, and somebody comes to me and their English is a little bit challenged, but they speak Spanish perfectly well, they're native speakers. And so I say to them, hey, good news. I pull out a map and I say, I've got a map right here. It shows all the Mexican-American neighborhoods, in all of Aurora. Pick one. Which one do you want to live in? Clear case of steering. I'm saying to them, your choices are limited. That's illegal. They have the right to choose where to live, and I should be asking them objective questions. Do you want to live near where you work? Where is that? Do you need expressway, public transportation? You're looking for a particular school district? What size house? You know, those kinds of things you would ask anybody, right? Qualifying the buyer, what are they looking for? That would matter. So what I do see from time to time also, though, is people of the same ethnicity presuming that their client wants to live in a mostly, say, Mexican-American or Polish or Russian, whatever neighborhood. It's still a case of steering. Somebody, if I'm Mexican-American or, you know, Mexican-born and living in the United States, and somebody comes to my office and I strike up a conversation, and clearly they come from the same place in the old country that I did, so I say, you know, buenas noticias, good news, and I pull out the same map and show them everything, it's no different. I've still limited their choices. The steering is problematic because you're not giving people the full range of choices. Provide people with objective information so they can make the decision subjective on their own terms. Find out from them what matters. Redlining is more a problem with appraisers, lenders, maybe insurance companies. We'll use lenders as the fall guys here. I mentioned this briefly, I think, in the lending chapter when we talked about the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA. I commented that in the 1940s, 1950s, lenders who would have been all white male bankers in those days took the position that as the North, in particular up in this area, as the North was segregating, more and more black Americans were leaving the rural South because the farm economy was being transformed away from the need for labor starting in, what, the 19-teens or 20s with, you know, automated farm implements, etc. So you get more and more people in the rural South moving to the urban North, and all of a sudden you had a lot of immigration that we've never had to deal with before, and so a lot of us, our ancestors, whatever, were tested with how we were going to deal with this. And so banks would look at that and go, well, we don't want to loan to neighborhoods that have too many blacks or Mexicans or Cubans or, you know, whatever they, Chinese or whatever they didn't want at the time. So they would literally have maps where they just drew red lines around certain neighborhoods and said, you know, we don't loan here. If you don't loan money in a residential neighborhood, what happens? Nobody can remodel, nobody can fix things up, there's no market for buyers, and it's the lenders themselves who caused the very problem they were fearing and wanted to put on other people. You can find neighborhoods to this day in places like Detroit where you literally can find a fence that divided the white and the black neighborhoods, and in some cases those fences are still there, or the railroad tracks, or whatever it is, some identifiable barrier that exists, and that became the boundaries that the lenders would use. We're not loaning there. That's redlining. Again, that's illegal. It's a violation. Can't do it as a real estate agent, can't do it as a lender, can't do it as an insurance company. Now, insurance companies can price risk differently based upon zip codes. We have higher, you know, thefts in this area, greater number of auto accidents in this area, but they can't refuse to insure altogether unless they do it statewide, because insurance is regulated on a state-by-state basis. So it's difficult for somebody like Allstate to say, well, we're going to continue to insure in Florida, but we're not going to insure along the coasts. They just pull out of the state entirely, for example, if they don't like it. Or what State Farm did recently when they had too high a percentage, was it in Illinois maybe? We'll keep writing our current policies, but we're not going to write any policies to new customers in Illinois because you have too big a share of the market, too much risk. So as to make it very clear that they were not discriminating on any kind of a redlining sort of basis. All right, so again, blockbuster steering, redlining. I think everything else in here is adequate. I will mention one thing with terrorism concerns. The Patriot Act actually requires commercial landlords, including multifamily, so whether it's office or residential, whatever, to report people that are on the do not fly list and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of scary, the responsibility. I haven't had to worry about that because of the nature of our tenants. But it's a challenging environment to live in when you're told on one moment to treat everybody like friends and family and neighbors, and other than credit and money, you know, give them access to what they want, and on the other hand, psst, hey buddy, you know, tell us about anybody who seems to be out of place or doing something that's, you know, not what you're expecting, or something that might run afoul of national security. Yet there it is. Not something you'll have to worry about as residential brokers probably, but as a commercial property manager and owner, if I got into that more deeply, it's something I would really have to study and try and figure out. Why don't we go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up and talk about how this is enforced. We're pretty close to being done with this, but then I still want the video and talk about a few more cases. So just a couple minutes to 8, no later than 8 o'clock, and we'll be back and we'll wrap this stuff up.